I'm going to move on now to our next presenter, which is Devin O'Neill. Now, Devin grew up barefoot on a sailboat in the US Virgin Islands, but somehow managed to settle in Colorado, strapping ski boots to his feet most days of the winter. Somewhere in between those two times, he earned a psychology degree from Middlebury College. He worked as a counterterrorism analyst in Washington, D.C., and held various reporter jobs before settling on being a freelance writer. Writing about adventure and sports is an easy fit for Devin because he's quite an adventurer himself, but he also enjoys the opportunity to delve deeper with investigative pieces and stories on how we deal with psychological trauma. And Devin will be chronicling an avalanche rescue at the height of a pandemic. So over to you, Devin.
Okay, Jennifer, thanks a lot. And good morning or good evening to everybody. Thank you for being here. I'm just going to dive right in here. You can see the title of the presentation there. And, you know, in general here, we were about 10 days into our shutdown in Colorado. The snow was really good. People were antsy. That Tuesday afternoon, I heard from a friend that there was a pretty large-scale avalanche rescue unfolding in Ophir, which is just this tiny town in the North San Juan Range near Telluride. At the same time, avalanche centers had started to shut down in Canada and the Pacific Northwest, and it just felt like the tide was changing and we were reaching a tipping point in terms of how the pandemic was colliding with the prime backcountry ski season. So I sent my editor a short email pitch at Outside Magazine late that afternoon, said I was going to start reporting first thing in the morning if he was interested. He assigned it at 800 words, a pretty standard length. Wednesday morning, the next morning, I called avalanche center directors in Colorado, Washington State, and British Columbia, but my editor then realized that the story was going to overlap with another one assigned by a different editor. They were not in as close touch at the time because they were working remotely. So mine asked me if I could take a closer look at the Ophir rescue in particular. I texted a skier I knew in Telluride, a guy born and raised there and is one of the standouts in that region, Greg Hope, to see if he had any connection to the rescue. It turned out his neighbor had been on scene and was willing to talk, and just a chain of contacts ensued from there. I recorded a dozen interviews over 2 days, transcribed them after my kids went to bed until like 2 a.m. You know, I felt a little uncomfortable asking questions about Ophir since it's one of the most closely guarded backcountry ski zones in America, really tight-knit community. But I also thought if I could get the fine details that this could really spin the conversation forward. And in talking to locals, it became clear that one person played a crucial role in the rescue and might be a good character to tell the story through. And that was an ER doctor named Dan Hare, who lives in Ophir and is also the chief of medical staff at the Telluride Hospital and a really good skier himself. So late Wednesday night, I sent a long email to Hare explaining what I was doing. I asked if he'd be open to talking, and he called me the next morning. That was kind of a turning point in this whole story. Why the facts were unique, kind of in other words, why this made for a really interesting story. There was limited time. The victim was dying. That was clear to everybody who was on scene immediately. He got hung up on a tree really high in the path, which meant he'd have to be lowered with severe injuries and no backboard down to the eventual LZ. COVID-19, you know, the virus was on everyone's minds when they responded to the accident. It was the backdrop for this story, and frankly, the reason that the story got told. And they needed a nimble helicopter with a pilot who could get there pretty much immediately, which was far from a guarantee. The patient was fading. I later learned that he did develop a pneumothorax and had to be revived at one point. But there were also ample rescuers. Everyone was sitting around at home wishing they had something to do and a reason to help. And yet we were all kind of just neutralized because of the pandemic and what was unfolding. Key skill sets, this amazes me still. Among the first civilians on scene, you had an emergency physician, an Everest guide, a Denali guide, an EMT, the director of the local heli ski company, and just super fit individuals who knew the terrain and witnessed the slide and were out there skiing as well. You know, there was this race to publish, and with a news story like this, there's always a little bit of urgency, but with this one in particular, you know, it was prime time for big line skiing. The snow was stellar. And there were just these constant messages to not stress the healthcare system by requiring a rescue. And this created this debate over whether to ski or not. And that created a social stigma and polarized the whole notion of going skiing. So I felt like people would benefit. People had gotten numb a little bit to hearing these warnings, and they would actually benefit in a different way from reading about an actual rescue during all this. So they'd understand what might happen if something went wrong on their own tour. I had a bunch of concerns with this. Typically a story this length would take weeks, if not months, to come together. It would be fact-checked by the magazine and go through this whole long, drawn-out process that's done to ensure accuracy. Intrusion, I could not relate to what everyone had just been through, and I knew I'd have to intrude on their lives further, which sucked. But in particular, I had to make multiple calls and email exchanges with Dan Hare, who, again, is an ER doc with a family, young kids, who just helped save someone's life on his day off. And then logistical challenge. I had 2 kids under 5 at home. My wife runs a nonprofit, was really busy. We were juggling a lot. So I was taking calls, running upstairs to close the door, record the interviews, come back down to just this battleground of a 2-year-old and 5-year-old. It was an intense week. But after I finished my interviews on Thursday afternoon, I stayed up all night that night writing the story. I spent a couple hours the next morning polishing it, and then I sent a draft to my editor around 10:30 a.m. that was 2,700 words, so about 3.5 times the initially assigned length. Went through 2 rounds of revisions that afternoon before we finally put it to bed around 8 p.m. And then the magazine published it first thing Saturday morning. This was a tough one. My editor asked a couple times during the frenzied reporting period if there was a chance to talk to the victim and his partner. And I just felt like that was asking too much of them so soon after the avalanche. I drew that line in my mind and just told my editor it was doubtful. But when I talked to Dan Hare, the doctor, again on Friday morning, to confirm a couple last minute facts, he indicated he might be able to connect me with Nathan Schroepfer, the victim's partner, who'd stopped by Hare's house to collect his friend's snowboard and pack on Wednesday night. So 2 minutes before I filed my final revision on Friday afternoon, Nathan called. I was really surprised to hear from him, but he was open about everything that happened. And really crucially, he told me his friend was in surgery and was expected to recover, which kind of just let us exhale about publishing this story as a whole. The question of names or no names comes up in every tough story that I do, and it's never black and white. Ultimately, I'm after information. And if it's a question of getting the information from an anonymous source or not getting it at all, I usually grant the source anonymity if they're requesting it. I did that with the first rescuer I spoke to, the neighbor of my friend Greg, who requested that their name not be used. And they also asked for a gender neutral pseudonym in the story. And this question also came up with Nathan Schroepfer. Nathan thought about it for a minute, but said he didn't want to hide from what happened. He wanted to take ownership. When I brought up the potential for blowback online and social media, he said, I can take it. I decided I wasn't going to name the victim, wasn't even going to try to, mainly because he was dealing with enough already and the story didn't really need it. I did feel like the blowback might be even nastier because this accident highlighted 2 really polarizing questions that everyone was considering at the time, which is, should people be skiing? And for land managers and sheriffs, should the backcountry be closed? They were managing this differently depending on the jurisdiction. But even some of the rescuers pushed back against the notion that the victim and his friend were reckless. These rescuers said getting into the backcountry was a key part of handling the stress of the pandemic themselves. And there was no resentment at all of the fact that they were called out to save someone's life at such a tricky time. So the story's aftermath, this story took off pretty quickly. It got shared thousands of times on that Saturday morning. I got texts and emails from a wide range of people, including sources in the story, but also rescuers from far away. What didn't make it in, it's always hard to leave out relevant info, but for various reasons, some stuff just doesn't fit in the narrative if you want to keep it flowing. And two things I want to mention because I think they're especially pertinent to this presentation. Nathan said that multiple other groups told him after the slide that they were headed to ski Sugar Shack, which was the path where this happened, for their next run, which I thought really reiterated the point that I tried to make in the story, that this could have happened to any number of people who were out there that day. Also, Nathan and his partner talked about everything having to do with their tour that day. They really planned all the minutia, except where the first two turns were to be made on that run. And his partner went a few feet farther into the path than Nathan expected, and that triggered the slide, which is not to say that it wouldn't have happened anyway, but I thought this was a really good fact for people to learn from, and it just didn't fit in the narrative, and that still bums me out. I had one really surprising takeaway about two-way radios. They're used extensively in that area of the North San Juans. Everyone who skis in Ophir uses the same channel by design, while other valleys near Telluride have different channels that are publicized for users. I thought that was an excellent model for other regions to consider, which is why I really tried to highlight it in the story. As Dan Hare, the doctor, told me, quote, "I feel like this is the first time that we've really seen the power of that radio program. And ultimately it helped save someone's life." You know, the accident party's aftermath, what feedback did they get? You know, in the beginning, it was mostly negative online. That changed as time passed, and over the months that followed, about 80% of the feedback, they said, has been really kind and supportive, but the other 20% has been really hurtful. I got back in touch with Nathan Schroepfer in September in advance of this presentation, and he said his main takeaway was the importance of sharing their experience. Quote, "You can't imagine it until it happens." He was basically talking about the force of the avalanche. "And we need to talk about it," he said. The reason I thought that was so interesting is because it diverged completely from his partner, Keith D'Angelo, who Nathan put me in touch with. That was the victim in the avalanche, and I'd never talked to Keith, but we had a really candid conversation recently, and Keith said the article had a pretty big impact on his life, but it wasn't positive. Quote, he said, "Frankly, I resent your story. I don't feel good about it, because I've had a lot of people in our community come up and tell me I didn't go skiing that day." Someone said that just last week to him. He said, "I felt like I had this giant spotlight shown on me, and I was almost a dartboard. It hurt. I don't like going out in my community anymore." You know, as the writer of that story, that was really hard for me to hear. I took it to heart. It was probably the most impactful part of that entire experience writing that story, and it really did impact my life for a while. The story itself, but when I heard Keith say that, you know, it just hit home, and I've thought about it a lot, and I don't know how much, if anything, I would change about our process, because I still felt like the message that story conveyed was important and timely, but it stuck with me, and it will when I write future stories like this. I did ask Nathan, would he talk so candidly again? And he said he would. Quote, he said, "To change this culture of, oh shit, I made a mistake, I'm gonna run and hide," to, I don't want anyone else to do the same thing. Let's just talk about this. I see the importance of this as maybe the beginning of a change in culture in discussing our mistakes as opposed to running from them in the snow world. There was also a crucial caveat, which was that Keith lived. If he had not, Nathan wasn't sure if he would have done things the same way, and he's certain he wouldn't have talked to a reporter so soon after it happened. You know, I also want to discuss more broadly, kind of the broader context that this story was told against, which is, what is journalism's role in accident reporting? What is the role of the news media? You know, there are similarities between official accident reports and news stories. That accurate facts are far more important than opinions, but you don't always get the same access depending on where it happened. You know, if you're someone like me, you know, in the Alps, I've been told there's a police investigation for a fatal avalanche, which opens up new ways to source information for a reporter. While in the US, you know, this is a much more litigious society. There's no guarantee everything will ever become public. Even in talking to people who write accident reports, formal official accident reports for a forecasting center, they tread lightly. You know, that they know that for the victims and the party involved to talk to them, it's a delicate process. They're not required to. You know, what happens when there's neither an official report or a story in the media? This is sometimes the case because maybe the remote location, like if a slide occurs in the middle of the Himalaya, or a victim's desire to keep it secret. You know, I think it'd be hard to say the community is well served by that void, but you could also argue that traumatic experiences belong to the people they happen to, and it's up to them whether to share if they're the only ones who know the details. What I'm trying to accomplish when I write an accident story, and I've written them for a range of magazines, I've written about my own close call. You know, first, it has to be unique for some reason. Like this one happened in the middle of a pandemic. I'm there to ask tough questions, to build context and a dramatic backdrop, really to humanize the characters so that maybe it will resonate deeper with people who can picture themselves there. But the hardest part is always balancing source privacy with reader benefit. It's a gray area every time. There is no clear answer for this other than to treat sources the way you'd want to be treated as a reporter and to be fair to all parties, even if that means someone might be frustrated later. You know, in preparing this presentation, I wanted to just kind of canvas the landscape a little bit. And so I surveyed just a mix of forecasters, educators, ski patrollers, avalanche techs, search and rescue volunteers, and just avid backcountry skiers who I know. And in general, they felt the news media can bridge this gap between official accident reports and the unregulated world of social media, which can be really nasty. They want news stories to show the emotion involved with accidents. You know, one person said, I feel like a reader might think, oh, you know, when it's over, but the rescuers go home and this stuff affects them and they live with it, you know, and when you show this emotion involved with accidents, it more clearly reveals the human side and the consequences of poor or unlucky decisions. One professional told me, quote, "We need people telling the whole story in ways that everyone can understand and access because really, this isn't happening sufficiently elsewhere." Why does the medium matters? You know, I feel like typically you get more depth from a written or digital interactive story like the New York Times feature on Tunnel Creek or Avalanche Canada's rescue at Cherry Bowl. But there might be more viewership with TV and radio, so maybe they're more effective at sharing, you know, urgent warnings, awareness, something that really is timely and vital to share right away. How much is too much? Judgment and analysis. This is always the hardest part. Some of the people I surveyed wanted more judgment and more critical analysis in accident reports delivered in a straightforward manner. But barring that, you know, they felt in-depth news stories are the best venue to incorporate serious analysis. You know, so moving into discussion, I really wanted to leave a good bit of time to talk about this. Of course, we're not going to have enough here, but if anyone has any questions or input on this, I'm interested in the community's take on this subject as well. So please feel free to contact me later. My email is on this slide. In particular, you know, I'm putting these questions up there because feel free to address any of them if you do have a comment or a question right now from the one in the headline there, but also any of the specific ones below. I'm kind of curious related to that first question, whether there are times when it would make sense for a forecaster to call a reporter after an accident and say, you know, hey, this happened and there were some significant aspects that didn't get much attention, but we think a journalist should look into it. You know, I feel like that's kind of this proactivity on the avalanche workers side that I don't know, I would welcome that as a reporter. I know I'm usually the one pestering people at a time when often they don't want to be pestered and there are really pressing issues on their plate. But yeah, I would just love to open this up to a little bit of discussion here. And if anyone has any input or questions, I'd be happy to address them.
Lots of really good food for thought there. I have some thoughts I'm mulling around in my head after your presentation, but let's see if there are any questions from the floor right now.
Currently have no questions from the floor, and I'm not sure if we have any from the chat box.
Okay, well, maybe that's my cue then. You were asking on your first topic, should reporters be proactive? And is there a time when, as a forecast center, you might call a reporter? And I kind of feel like it would really depend on a strong relationship of trust that was already kind of pre-built with that reporter, because not all news reports are of equal value to the public, and we all know that sometimes it seems more like headline grabbing, and we are, as forecast centers, trying to reduce that stigma like you talked about, and kind of change that culture so that we can learn from accident reports. Do you actually work to build that trust with any of the forecast centers near you?
I would say every time that it's not like I take people out to dinner or something to build that trust, but every time that I have an interaction, whether it's a simple email or a phone conversation, or more rarely seeing people in person, I definitely do. I want them to know that, I respect their job, and I respect that there are boundaries that have to be drawn, but I'm there to report accurate facts. And also, I'm really interested in this subject. I'm a backcountry skier myself, and I feel like that, coming at it from that almost an empathetic, I've had some close calls myself as well, and I think building that trust is simply doing a good job. If they put their trust in you, then don't screw it up, and honor it. And then the next time, that trust will grow a little bit. So it's something that is always on my mind, and I do consciously think about it. But I would say just doing a good job is the best way to build trust that I've found.
Awesome. I think we have a few questions in the queue now. Brent?
Hi, we've got a few folks here. The first one up is Benjamin Yeager. Go ahead, Benjamin.
Hey, Devin, thanks for the time today, and thanks for the article. I definitely remember reading that and discussing it quite a bit within my backcountry travel groups at the time when that happened. Did you find, I guess, a way to quantify or measure if that article really slowed people down from going out into the backcountry? Did you have people reaching out saying that, thank you for writing that, that really changed my perspective? Or, what sort of mindsets did you see from people after that?
Anecdotally, yes. This was something I actually asked the victim and his partner, Nathan and Keith, and they both said that people came up to them, usually like friends or people that they knew personally, and they were like, bike season started the moment that I heard about your guys' accident. Multiple people, pretty much everybody that they knew personally who talked to them were like, I did not ski again after that story came out, after that accident happened. And Nathan in particular, who lived in Ophir, he said it was probably 10 days before I saw another person touring. And in the days leading up to that, there were dozens upon dozens upon dozens of people out touring that he saw every day. I do think that I had people texting me like, hey, Devin, just so you know, I haven't been skiing. And I'm like, I am not the arbiter here. But I think that it did change the conversation, and I think for me as a skier too, it was hard not to have reported on that and still think the same way about the current situation that we were all in, the same way that I had before that happened.
Awesome, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Do we have someone else lined up there, Brent?
Yeah, you bet. Next up, we have Rupert Woodward. Go ahead, Rupert. Hello, Rupert. There we go.
Hello, Brent. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you, Devin, for your presentation. I am in Jasper. I'm with the Parks Canada Search and Rescue Program and have been for 30 years now. Just a comment back to you regarding speaking to the press and the media. There's been a spectrum of practices over my tenure in search and rescue. And currently, we are directed not to speak to the media directly after incidences. We prepare what is called a serious incident report, which captures the details of incidences and gets passed up to senior management. As Grant showed in his presentation, we tend to have a media and executive liaison officer who speaks to the accidents and instances that are ongoing. Typically, I and people in my role will reach out to the Canadian Avalanche Association and Avalanche Canada, and sometimes the Guides Association if there have been serious accidents, to bring them up to speed on relevant facts, because they will often be spoken to by persons like yourself or major media outlets. So we'll give them the details, often just the technical information. And then if the media still want to have access to the first responders, for example, or the program managers, it's usually done in a very scripted manner. The parks, for example, will collect the questions that you'd like answered, and they get presented to us, and that's often how it's handled. So I hope that helps you in your interest in that.
Yeah, and I respect those processes. I have to be honest, as a reporter, I'm always trying to respect those and yet kind of inch forward and like get as much as I can ever that could be gotten while respecting those official procedures. I know it's pretty unrealistic to get like the true nuts and bolts really quickly after an accident. This was an exceptional incident. Obviously there was the timeliness involved with me trying to publish the story quickly, but it was exceptional because there were people, I didn't expect people to talk to me, frankly. That was one reason that I told my editor initially, I pitched this like more broad story. And when he started to push me, I was like, oof, okay, I'll try, but I think the fact that there were all these civilian rescuers who were accessible through this chain of contacts, that meant that I could still tell the story accurately using firsthand sources without intruding on that kind of official process. In Colorado, with the CAIC, there's a similar, Ethan Green is the director, and Ethan, prefers to have all communication to the media go through him, which I totally understand and respect. And I think it's a very effective, streamlined way. In this case, I was looking for ways to get accurate information without having to bug those guys and without having to be calling Ethan all the time and saying, well, what have you heard late? What's the latest? And being able to find people who were there and were open and willing to talk, I think also spoke to their view on this. Those civilian rescuers understood that, it might benefit people to hear about how everything went down that day so they understand, so that maybe that would change behavior in a pretty immediate fashion. So that was my goal, and yet I was also trying to like straddle that line.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Devin. I think we've really got the ball rolling. Unfortunately, we're just out of time, but I think you'll find there's some really great questions that have appeared in the chat box, and maybe people would appreciate if you're able to follow up, or they can contact you via your email address. Lots to consider there. Thanks.
Thanks, Jennifer.